This is the AP African American Studies exam slideshow. We will be going through the AP exam. These are the 4 units. These are the quick summaries, so at some point you will see these slides. For Unit 1, primarily this is about geography, ancient African empires, and eventually the events leading up to the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the European view of Africa as the dark continent. Here we have some of the required images from the AP framework. This image right here is about Africa geography and how climate zones are going to determine where those empires emerge. This is a chart that I've created that simply looks at various empires, the letter to the king, and of course the painting showing the influence of African Americans as they spread from Africa to other parts, which you can also get from this map with regard to trade. Unit 1 focuses on the themes. And one of the things I would suggest as you prepare for this exam is to definitely brush up on your vocabulary. Try not to be vague in your replies. You want to provide as much information as you possibly can. For example, I'll use an example from Unit 4. Often I'll read a response where somebody will put something about nonviolence during the civil rights movement. Well, that's a perfect opportunity to use SCLC, identify King as the advocate for nonviolence. And for the most part, the more you use your vocabulary, you're going to show the reader that you understand the material. So this chart right here is Unit 1, going through the CED for the AP African American Studies course description. And basically what I did was I isolated all of the important terms. I've defined them and provided the significance, that argument of Africa being the dark continent, and the long-term significance of this being a term that leads to Eurocentric biased views. I also did this for the sources, so feel free to just go into Google, put in the name of the source, and ask it to give you a definition, and you can create your own chart. And again, the more you reference some of the terminology, you define some of these sources, the better off your written responses are going to be. So here we are looking at a short answer question. And usually I'll tell students when you see the ABC section, that is where you want to basically, identify the image. You want to be precise in your answer because they are looking for accuracy. Either you know the information or you do not. Again, feel free to put this search into AI or Google and it'll give you a pretty good explanation. So here we are looking at a response to this particular question. And I always say to include context. Now, you don't really need to write this much for this type of question. This is usually for the essay. But I would always say write more because hopefully something is going to stick as long as you are just not too far off. For example, you definitely do not want to talk about James Vanderzee from Unit 3 in your response here. So try to keep everything to Unit 1 if that is going to be your strategy. You want to have some sort of thesis, and then you always want to provide some context. When you provide that context, you're providing some of that background information, the significance. What decade are we talking about? What time period? What were some of the issues that were going on? And then you can answer the question. So let's look at this response here. This is from one of the AP sessions. So we have the responses, I believe, to just these first two. Describe one feature of the Mali Empire represented by the figure depicted. So before AP scorers sit down and look at a response, they have to calibrate. And what that means is they have to decide what they are going to accept as an answer. So this would be from a scorer's point of view. This is what they're looking for. A feature of the Mali Empire represented by the statue is their use of horses to extend their power over neighboring groups. This would be vague, but look at what they're looking for. They're just looking for you to identify the significance of the horse. Mali Empire's wealth, access to trans-Saharan trade routes. Now they're using some terminology, which is why I stress you need to know some of the vocabulary. Then they bring in the issue of weapons. Significance here, if you have animals, if you have weapons, that means that you are stationary. That means that you are not on the move. If the horse is being used for military, that means that you have probably something to protect. So let's look at some of the responses here. Again, they're answering this question, one feature of Mali represented by the figure depicted, and this is an actual response to A. Notice how they're bringing in some terminology, the Mali Empire, Trans-Sahara. That's what I mean by including some terms and defining exactly what you are explaining in your reply. So here you have another response, and this one definitely is not as detailed as the prior one. The jewelry displayed. Now, the fact that they picked up on jewelry actually means something, because, if you have jewelry, then that means you have time to kind of sit in your empire and create jewelry. In other words, you're not always on the run. You're not always traveling from one place to another. If you're stationary, once you have an enormous amount of people there, you're probably going to need a government. You are probably going to need some sort of economy, and you would have the time to actually make jewelry. So this becomes, if they would have expanded into this one here, that probably would have made a little bit more of a difference in the response. So here we have a example. This is from one of my classes here, and it is looking at, I believe this is Unit 3. How has the history of African Americans been visible in artistic expression, and discuss the needs to incorporate such history in artistic expression. So when I score, I usually notice here, like, you might not be in a situation where the score is going to give you 3/4 out of this particular point. So like I said, you definitely want to make sure that you're including as much possible, and as long as you have some understanding of time and you're not too off in your writing. In other words, you're writing about something from Unit 1, then you're talking about something in Unit 4, demonstrating no understanding of time and sequence, that will become problematic. So I always tell my class to start with your thesis. African American history has an impact in African America by using their oppression from America, created positively art from it. So what I'm getting here, even though I'm struggling as I try to read this here, basically what they're looking at here is that African American history has reflected itself in the art. African American history has impact in African Americans by using their oppression from America and created possibility art from it. So I kind of get the point that they're trying to make. And then notice how they're giving me a little bit of context here, that from 1525 to 1960s, African Americans faced oppression and nonstop racism. So the context, you just want to provide some background information before you actually get into your source. And here you see them getting into that one particular source right here. Here we have another response. African American history has pushed those to succeed the expectations and the motivate all to stay above them. So we don't really have a thesis, which is why I scored this a 0 out of 1. It just seems to be rambling. I don't quite get what their argument is. Then they are making an attempt at that context. Creativity and oppression was a perfect way to do that. Well, to do what? Expand on this particular point. African Americans were belittled. All right, well, that's not relevant. This would be an opportunity for you to give me an example of that belittlement that you're experiencing as people shame for their culture. So that's what I mean by just providing some detail. So I'll always say to use this structure. Give me that thesis. Follow this particular structure here. Give me 2 background sentences, and then you want to always identify the source. Identify it, explain that particular source, and then you need to answer how that source you identified supports the thesis here. So for the most part, you're always identifying that source, providing a summary. That's where you're identifying that source, showing that you understand what that source is, but then for the analysis, you always have to answer the question, how does that source identified support the thesis? And what's the thesis? It's the thesis here that you have provided. Here we just have a couple of images, looking at some of those empires. Kind of going to go through these real quick because I'm not really trying to focus on some of the content. Here we have a chart just looking at some of the societies and empires that we looked at. I tried to place some of the images in that particular, as they pertain to those empires here. This one here is about trade. That AP rubric. Now what I would suggest is take that AP rubric, upload this in it to AI. I've actually done this. I've uploaded this into AI, and then I've asked it to score student responses to see how harsh I'm grading in comparison to how the AI would grade, but it's a good way for you to actually, you know, make your writing more precise and clearer. Here we go, some additional tips. Upload a rubric, select a series of sources, ask AI to generate a question, and then respond to those questions. And again, always provide detail. That summary for Unit 1 is about African geography, those empires, and eventually how Africa came into contact with other civilizations through globalization, as well as the events leading up to the transatlantic slave trade. So here we have some sample questions here using one of the sources, and the answer here is A. Here we have a sample question. All of the following would be a prerequisite in a society for currency in the Aksumite Empire, but which one? Strong central government would count. A thriving economy counts. Military as well as a national government. Now notice you probably will see a similarity with regard to those two options there. But what I'm looking for here is religion is probably the one out of this list here that is not required for any particular empire. That would be not required for an empire. For empire, you definitely want a military, you want to have a thriving economy and a strong government that can make laws or make sure that things are going to be protected. We're now going to look at Unit 2. And Unit 2 overview is looking at the transition to permanent hereditary involuntary servitude and the role that laws play in making slaves and their children permanent. It also focuses on what slavery was like, where people went to Central, South, and North America, and eventually ending with the... So here we have some of the slides that I selected that give a pretty good overview. We start off with those slave codes, and the slave codes is what gets all of the freed Africans into permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. Most of the sources at the beginning look at how Africans were free at first or had the possibility to become free, and then we get to laws that were passed that slowly take away the rights. It does talk about all of the phases of the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, and so on. It looks at sources for sale, where people were going, and then eventually you start to see the case regarding citizenship, Africans holding on to their identity, and then Africans expressing themselves through art as well as advocating for their rights and holding on once again to their cultural identity. And then it ends where you start looking at some of the strategies that were used to try to end slavery and some of the thinkers and what their thoughts were in regards to the institution. This is the image looking at some of those slave codes. So for the most part, we're talking about Africans being free, and then slowly these laws being passed that erode their status as free. They're not going to be citizens, but eventually they're going to get to permanent slavery. Again, most of the first couple of sources are looking at this particular point that Africans, or in this case black conquistadors, were free. And so it's looking at how that transition actually takes place, which is why I keep mentioning permanent involuntary hereditary servitude, where people were going, because eventually you're going to see Central and South America playing a key role. It's not just about slaves going to this part of the world. Sad when you look at this, all of the people that are dying. That's a result possibly of that Middle Passage and some of the treatment. Again, that Middle Passage, those laws that were designed. For example, this one right here gets revised after the Stono Rebellion. It's unlawful for any such white person to pursue, apprehend, moderately correct such slave. So it's all about trying to keep the slave through laws in their position to maintain the institution of slavery. The Dred Scott case is a nail in the coffin because it basically says you are not a citizen. And then the use of African quilt making, manifesting some of the things that were created by slaves. As I mentioned before, some of the strategies, people using violence, people trying to appeal to the good nature of the slave master through moral suasion, or simply just writing about the experience of what slavery was like. This also introduces intersectionality, and I believe one of the last sources is about sexual assault. Don't forget about the maroon communities that are going to be established, the alignment with Native American tribes, trying to defend those maroon communities. And this was the source that I was mentioning about slavery and sexual assault. So that whole intersectionality, it's one thing to be a male slave, it's another thing to be a female slave. Where are they similar? Where would those experiences be different? So here we have the transition from the 1800s into the Civil War, where we have that slave convention, and then eventually this leads to the Civil War, which ends slavery, and then you have the women's rights movement that's happening pretty much at the same time. African Americans participating in the Civil War, which of the following will be the result of forced exodus from Africa to different parts of the world. All of these apply but one. I'm not sure how many of these particular questions are going to be used on the test. Tension between Africans and the inhabitants of the region will emerge due to the cultural differences. That is definitely a possibility. You know, as these people go here, what's going to happen as they interact with other groups? If reproduction occurs, different racial groups will come into existence. That is also going to be something that's going to take place. The government will need to pass various laws to deal with emerging issues caused by the forced exodus. That counts. Asia will encounter the bulk of human beings who are being forcibly sent from Africa. This is entirely wrong. Most of the people are going here, so the correct answer would be D. Here we're looking at the text of the Constitution. Which of the following does the text of the Constitution accomplish that impacted slavery from a legal point of view? Does it reference the treatment of Native Americans, refers to slavery, but avoids using the term slave or slavery? That is definitely an issue there. Determines representation and taxation, discharges people from labor. It does not do that. Determines when enumeration will occur and the impact of people. So, because it's asking you from the point of view for the impact on slavery, it's going to be this one here. This answer right here is going to be. Here we are looking at the Unit 3 overview, which basically starts with the end of the Civil War and how the local, state, and federal governments dealt with the end of the Civil War and eventually transitioned to segregation through a series of laws known as the Black Codes, which should not be confused with the slave codes. The violence that is going to ensue, which eventually leads to the Great Migration, as well as the migration from the Caribbean, that is going to change the situation for black. So here we have the quick timeline. We start with the end of the Civil War, where the South was cut into military districts through Reconstruction, and they helped to deal with things like African Americans participating in government. They then would use a series of alternate tactics to bypass the 13th through 15th Amendments, sharecropping, and other strategies. The violence that would take place through lynching, the burning of Tulsa, continued experience for black women, intersectionality, some of the poetry and songs that are explaining the circumstances after the Civil War, HBCUs, and then of course James Van Der Zee using a series of photographs to challenge the depiction of African Americans in society. Collectively, the violence and the experience would lead to the Great Migration, and as well as new political thinking to change the circumstances experienced by black Americans. This slide is looking at the South cut up into military districts, federal government, the legislatures working during the Reconstruction period, the methods that were used to bypass and find loopholes around the 13th through 15th Amendments, violence, intersectionality, and then of course some of the songs and poems that are going to describe what life was like at this particular point. The raising of funds for HBCUs, as well as portraying a positive portrayal of African Americans, because African Americans are dealing with the Jim Crow persona, where they are struggling with trying to convince society about something that's other than racist and stereotypical, which is where James Van Der Zee, his collection of photographs, challenged that narrative. That violence would eventually lead to the Great Migration, African Americans going into major cities, and then of course different thinking from Unit 2, Marcus Garvey advocating for Caribbeans as well as go back to Africa, Ida B. Wells focusing primarily on the violence, Du Bois coming up with his idea of double consciousness. course, looking into the history, the Negro digs up his past to try to see what African history actually was and how that could impact the psyche of the black or African American living in the United States. Here we have the Freedmen Bureau. Which of the following does a source not address? A solution to protecting the rights of the former slave? Well, that's what the Freedmen Bureau was about. And so we look at some of these choices. State military officials are going to enforce payment. Well, that's not going to happen. Freedmen Bureau operatives are doing their best as outlined by the creation. That makes no sense. What they were basically trying to do is solve and guarantee the protection of the freed slaves after the Civil War. Which line from Carter G. Wood's, The Study of the Negro, most likely influences students in the image? So the students here are going to be influenced by what they're learning with regard to African history, and then they're going to argue that by teaching black studies, black students are going to have a different perception. We then transition to Unit 4. And Unit 4 is basically the Civil Rights Movement and some of the more modern day movements. It does start with war. World War I and World War II, but we do start to see some colonialism thought, Kwame Nkrumah, war, redlining strategy, which leads to more segregation, then eventually the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson, and then how the Civil Rights Movement emerges to try to reverse some of the circumstances experienced by black Americans, Black Panther Party, the Black Arts Movement, black feminist women, and then some of the data showing the black middle class. And then from there, it's basically music, TV, sports, science, and Afrofuturism. So basically, what this source here is looking at is looking globally and looking at colonialism or imperialism and how there are European forces that are colonizing Africa and how that experience is somewhat similar and possibly a macrocosm of what's happening at a micro level in the United States. So colonialism might be a way to explain what the black experience is like in America. Kwame Nkrumah, first leader of Ghana after decolonization, significant because King represents the United States. And here we have a global leader and basically experiencing some of the same issues going on, whether it's colonialism on a global scale or segregation and discrimination, second-class citizenship in America. World War II, redlining significant because it's going to further increase those segregation borders. The overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson with the Brown versus Board of Ed, where the students or the people in this, the kids in this photograph are going to develop a belief in inferiority, which can only come from the prejudice, discrimination, as well as the social disadvantages, which is how they prove Plessy versus Ferguson and eventually overturn it. You will have to know some of these civil rights organizations, and they call these the Big Four, NAACP, SCLC. So they're in the courts. They're using nonviolence. They're also using nonviolence. CORE actually goes back to World War II. And eventually you'll see New Thinking with the Black Party. Another new way to think about the experience for Black America is to look at the Black is Beautiful campaign and how you want to display images that show your authentic self with regard to Africa. Intersectionality, looking at how black women are experiencing, and not too different from what's happening in other units 2 and 3, bring up some of that as well. Then they transition to the black middle class, and we're going to look at prosperity, so you're probably going to have to analyze some data. Hip-hop, and what they're trying to look at is how hip-hop has its origins in some of the blues, some of the spirituals. They then look at black life in TV and film. Oscar Micheaux thinking about how he can also challenge some of those stereotypes, having a production company to tell stories. Then it looks at sports, and then Afrofuturism. Here we have a question. Black Americans made honorable contributions in American War, and then you'd have to look at these images, and for the most part, all of these do support that. So there's probably one missing here that does not support that particular thesis. Here we have the answer for the 4 civil rights groups. Some data. Answer is So here we have another question where I basically put these four movements and you have to figure out which way the answers actually go. So you kind of have to line them up here. I don't believe that's the answer. I didn't actually read it yet. Black arts movement, experience of individual drastically changing depending on number of minority one group belongs to. So that is not going to be the correct answer here. This would probably be better for interlocking. So that's going to be down here, the experience of the individual. Self-determination, that fits with black nationalism. Connecting the oppression, that looks right. And so choice D would be the correct one. So again, Unit 1 is looking at ancient African empires prior to slavery. This is the transition with that African diaspora to the laws that eventually lead to permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. Unit 3 is looking at the post-Civil War and how that violence leads to that Great Migration. And then Unit 4 is looking at the Civil Rights Movement. Keep in mind, you definitely want to make sure you know some vocabulary. Make sure you're boosting that vocabulary. Have an understanding of those sources. You're able to define them. Do Google searches for this one. When you're writing, make sure that you're providing that context. Make sure that you are providing your evidence. You are identifying the source. You want to make sure you can correctly identify those sources. And don't forget about some of the strategies here where AP readers do get together and kind of discuss the basics of as far as what they are going to accept for an answer. And don't forget some of these responses here that seem to be simple. I cannot stress enough, make sure you are providing detail. Make sure you are providing vocabulary. For the most part, the readers are looking to pass you. You want to make sure that you're able to convince them. And the more detail you provide in your writing, the better off you are going to be. Do not pull one of these. And if you are, make sure you expand on that jewelry. Make sure you expand on that horse. That horse is significant because it represents, that you have domesticated on some level animals. Why are you doing that? Do you need it for, farming? Do you need it to protect what you have? That's a basic answer that doesn't really require historical understanding. These slides basically are looking at some of my takeaways after attending some AP sessions. You want to show linkage from one unit to the next. Make sure you're quick and precise, especially with those short answer questions. Consider the sources, and if you can, identify the basics of the source. Where does it fit in the course? What is the source's purpose? Think about those units. Unit 1, 2, 3, 4. Each has a theme. Unit 1 is about African empires. Unit 2 is about slavery. 3 is about the end. 4 is about that civil rights movement. Keep the format simple. Use my process, thesis, context, source 1. Answer the question how that source supports the thesis. Give me your second source. How does that source support the thesis? Give me your third source, and so on. That's how you go about answering these essay-based questions. Consider which events are in chronological order. Don't place Martin Luther King in Unit 1. Right. Points are not deducted, but points are awarded. Make sure you are writing. Make sure you are providing detail. Hopefully this session helps. Good luck on your exam.